Hello, welcome to this Integrated Skills Wider Waste webinar. Good to have you along. Thanks very much for joining. My name is Stuart Henshaw. I'm the Business Development Director at Integrated Skills. And today we're looking at the government's waste strategy, and I'm joined by Victoria Crawford from Eunomia, who very kindly is going to give us her take on the government's waste strategy. Hi, Victoria, how are you?
Yeah, great, thanks. Good to be involved and talking about this yet again.
Absolutely. We were first talking about this, just to give you a bit of context. I think it was 2019. The strategy had come out, and I asked Victoria to do a kind of an update on the first webinar, and I think this is now our sixth annual webinar with an update on the government's waste strategy. So I don't know what to really say about that. What are the learning points from that, Victoria? Do you think?
Progress is slow.
Progress is slow. Yeah. And with the government's aim that this is actually the whole point of this is simplification and making it very, very straightforward. I think it's actually been quite a complex route so far. Would you agree?
Yeah. And many questions still yet to be answered,
Yeah.
as we'll get onto when we get into the slides.
Well, Victoria, thank you very much for joining us and for doing the work and doing the sort of the background research and taking us through sort of knowledge as it is at the moment on the waste strategy. As you say, there's still things that are unknown, things we won't get to know until a few months' time. And I think for this, the whole waste strategy is really a kind of a project in progress, and it will kind of reveal itself over the coming years as we see the impacts of some of the measures that have been put in place. But just to say a little bit about Victoria. Victoria is an award-winning fellow of the Chartered Institute of Waste Management. She's a chartered environmentalist, has been working in resources and waste management since 2006. We first met, we just talked earlier on, probably between 2006-07 time, wasn't it? So we've been working we worked for the same company then. We've both taken different routes, but we've known each other for all that time. In that time, Victoria's provided technical support, advice on service performance, legislation, provided technical support on legislation and policy compliance, contract procurement, contract renegotiation, and you've done some support for insourcing services too. What haven't you covered? Okay, you've covered materials processing, refuse and recycling collections, recycling treatment and waste disposal, street cleansing, grounds maintenance. You've also got a wealth of knowledge, on waste and recycling collection options appraisals, waste flow modelling, carbon impacts, carbon modelling, resource and finance modelling, including the consideration of impacts on working practice. Victoria, what have you been doing with your time?
Lots of procurement of late. Preparing for procurement and understanding how will these feed into that?
Yeah, quite. So just today, a few notes on today. I'm just going to give a little bit of a background to the webinar, what we do, how long we've been doing it, what were some of the things we are looking to cover over the next sort of few months, a little bit about Integrated Skills as a company. Then I'm going to hand over to Victoria, who's going to introduce herself and take us through the kind of the state of play where we are with the government's waste strategy to date. So I'll hand over to you in a second, Victoria, but just to start with, I just wanted to say a few bits and pieces about this webinar. This webinar was started probably 6 years ago, and I think you were one of the first people to actually to join the webinar. We've been running this bi-monthly ever since. We've got a wealth of topics now and discussions on our archive, and there's a URL there. There's a link to the webinar archive on integratedskills.com. And just to say, the next couple of webinars, one, well, I do know the date of and is confirmed, is the 26th of June. We're looking at, for a change, we're looking at street cleansing, and we're looking at revolutionizing street cleansing with new tech, some new tech that's been involved, and we're talking about a project that we're working on. We've got a couple of local authorities talking about some projects that they're working on involving new tech. kind of long overdue, I think, really, to give street cleansing an opportunity and to think about some of the issues. For too long, street cleansing has probably been the Cinderella kind of service, really in the shadow of waste collection. And then my other webinar that I'm trying to get in before summer is looking at unitary authorities and waste management. I think this will be really interesting. I'm just waiting for the speaker to confirm, but so I didn't want to reveal the date or the name of the speaker, but this is someone who heads up services and has been through the whole unitary authority process a number of years ago. And I'm hoping they're going to be speaking on, the trials and tribulations of going through unitary authority status and bringing numbers of small authorities together in a unitary authority, how they went about aligning the services, and what are the lessons that they learned from that, and what advice would they give to anyone going through a unitary status project. So looking forward to that. In addition, we'll be at the LAREC conference and the RWM conferences in autumn, which should look forward to seeing you there. There'll be more news of upcoming webinars in June. I wanted to say a little bit about integrated skills, just for kind of a little bit of a promotion session for the company. We do a range of things. We used to be primarily you would say we were consultants, and we were looking at sort of waste and financial consulting within the waste industry. We've moved and shifted really in what we do. In the main, we are now a software development house, but we still provide particularly route optimization services and consultancy services. And as you can imagine, we've been pretty busy in the run up to the government strategy. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, and the type of things we do. So we've have InCab technology. We both provide services for route optimization, and we provide software. We also run trade waste management software, jobs management software too. One of my kind of roles at the moment in the business is actually is really talking about our InCab and back office system, where we're really trying to change the conversation around InCab and back office. And the more I speak to local authorities, the more I'm realizing that local authorities don't really want their drivers, their crews to be interacting with a device at all, really. So we've built this device based on what we call at the moment minimal touch technology, which is effectively everything is by exception wherever possible, and the driver or the user would only interact with the device whenever absolutely necessary. Importantly, the device will be speaking to the crew and the drivers to, typically, assisted collection at number 22 and that kind of comment, saving them going on and interacting and with the device. Just a few more comments about that. Very kindly, some of our early adopters have called this the most flexible InCab system they've seen, which is very nice of them. One of our technology partners described it as a superior product. We developed this with a local authority focus group. So 5 local authorities came together to help us pull together the specification and the requirements for it. And so we're very grateful to them, but we feel that has really benefited the product itself. I mentioned earlier on, we're reducing the amount of interaction. So things like street complete function is automatic. We're using GPS technology to actually understand where the vehicle is and how, at what point the street is actually completed. Service information and route directions, if you've requested those on the device, are provided to the drivers in a just-in-time approach. So just as they need it, and you can configure when that point is. And with mentioned mentioning safety is becoming increasingly an issue now for people using InCab devices. So we're minimizing the interaction, as I mentioned earlier on, and moving to a by exception kind of approach. So just turning to the work we do on route optimization, this might be quite interesting. I was speaking to my colleague who is the client services director here and leads all our projects with local authorities, and I thought I'd give you a quick kind of highlight and his very brief summary of what he thinks the priorities are and what we're doing with many of our consultancy clients. When it comes to Residual waste, the emphasis really is a move to fortnightly. It's almost entirely a move to fortnightly wherever we're doing work now for authorities. They're using this opportunity within the strategy to sort of move from their weekly collections to a fortnightly collection for residual, which makes total sense and is certainly achievable and feasible. The next sort of stage of that, I suppose, is the question: how far are people going with 3 weekly now? The brakes have been taken off by the Labour government on the fortnightly as a minimum or as a maximum requirement. We're finding a number of authorities have moved already to 3 weekly collections. Certainly, many authorities across in Wales, but we're finding that where people are moving to 3 weekly tends to be in kind of collections in hubs, if you like, where people feel they can use the power of the collective of a number of authorities together moving to 3 weekly to convince their elected members that this is not too risky. We do lots of modelling for fortnightly, but also people keen to look at what a 3 weekly model would be. And in the main, if not almost exclusively, always the case, 3 weekly collections are possible. And we've had a number of occasions where these have gone as far as getting political approval, but then still, it's thought by many politicians it's too risky to actually go through with 3 weekly collections. So we're in a position at the moment with fortnightly tennis is the sort of the go-to option, with some authorities working together on 3 weekly, 4 weekly. I just have to congratulate those Welsh authorities who've gone down that track. We know that 4 weekly residual collections are certainly feasible, and with the changes made through EPR and simpler recycling, they will definitely be technically feasible. Our feeling is just at this moment, certainly in England, this will take a while for politicians to get their heads around it, to make that jump. Finally, wanted just to talk a little bit about food waste. Lots of our food waste work with authorities is actually obviously prepping for separate food waste services, and the work we've been doing so far is actually modelling services for food waste, particularly with a view to saying, okay, what are the numbers of vehicles I actually need to order? And I think it's still at around about 8 months, that vehicle order period. So there's still sort of opportunity for people to get those vehicle orders in before the launch of the food waste collections, before they're required. But we're doing lots of modelling, and particularly some of those modelling exercises are looking at the uncertainty about participation. And the discussion between authorities is how many people are actually going to participate in the food waste service. Is it 30 at the low end? Is it 30%, or is it as high as 60%? And there's a range of authorities in between those as well. So we spend some of our time actually modelling those different percentage participations, and provide an estimation on number of vehicles that they're going to need for their fleet. And we also, while we're talking about food waste, we also have a waste composition analysis team, and much of the work we're doing at the moment is just specifically looking at residual waste and looking particularly at the amount of food waste that is available within the residual stream, and from that they can make a good guess as to what would be presented by the public. Turning to recycling scenarios, we're doing a lot of modelling alternate weekly recycling. So paper and card in week 1, plastics, cans and glasses in week 2 using the same vehicle. We're also doing some modelling on the alternate fortnightly recycling. So over a month, you'd have 2 fortnightly services, one for paper and card and the other service for plastics, cans and glass. And then obviously we're doing more work on things like modelling twin stream recycling versus commingled recycling. So there's certainly plenty going on in our consultancy team on the route optimization. My other note is to say that we are doing a free consultation with any authority who wants to get in touch with us. We can have one of our senior routing consultants speak to you about your situation for an hour, around about an hour, if that was of interest. But yeah, so that's an offer we'd like to extend to any of you on the webinar. That is really kind of some of the impact on what we've been doing. I've probably talked for long enough, Victoria, and it's time to hand over to you to take us through your thoughts on simpler recycling and EPR. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. I'll just start with a very brief introduction to Eunomia. So we are a consultancy primarily focused on all things waste, but also climate, nature, energy and related services. We've got about 150 consultants and we are based in the UK, but also in New York, Brussels and Auckland. And we are now a B Corp company. So that's just a little bit about us. So I'll start by running through sort of the simpler recycling, where we're at with that. But it's difficult to talk about that in isolation without interviewing some of the EPR or packaging EPR updates that we've also had that are kind of happening in tandem. So this was a statement made by DEFRA in October 2023. I'm not sure it ends the confusion entirely, but we'll at least collect the same materials. So I guess that's a start. So what was the government looking to achieve now? So these are the headlines updated to reflect the new government and the changes since last year. So it's been implemented for businesses now as of March 2025, but it's probably not an understatement to say that it's not been fully adopted as yet. And there's probably quite a high proportion of companies that currently don't have collection systems that meet the simpler recycling requirements at the present time. So we've got food waste coming in by March 2026 for all, unless you're a local authority with those transitional arrangements in place. And that's typically where you have disposal contracts which will be impacted negatively by the implementation of food waste, and where it's too expensive to amend that contract. The government has allowed for a transitional arrangement, effectively delaying the start of the food waste if that was your local situation. We've got the increased range of recyclables from March 26, which will include glass, pots, tubs and trays and cartons on top of the other materials that most already collect by March 26, and then plastic film following a year later. And then we've had the confirmation that garden waste collections are where requested and that they may be chargeable. So we've got an update on the policy timeline just to show some of the additional things that are happening in the next couple of years. So the next few to occur that are important for local authorities are that this year there'll be, or this fiscal year, there'll be 3 grant determination letters, which will be provided to the local authorities' chief executives. And in June this year, there will be another assessment notice, which will essentially set out what the funding will be. And then between October and December this year will be when the first tranche of payments will be made to local authorities under EPR. And then January to March next year, the second and third payments for this fiscal year will follow. Then in March 26, we've got obviously simpler recycling being implemented. And then from April onwards, local authorities will receive 4 payments each year, so 1 each quarter, under packaging EPR. And then we've got a few other things. So we've got plastic film, we've got the delayed DRS planned to go live in October 27 at the latest, I think it says in the legislation. And then we've had recent confirmation from DEFRA that the packaging EPR payments for public binned waste will be delayed until after DRS. And in England, that is related to waste placed in litter bins. So that's packaging waste in litter bins. And then there's some, well, both in Scotland and Wales, they are also including ground litter. And there's a bit of a question mark about the timing of when those are likely to come in. It may be post DRS or it might be that those devolved nations decide to go earlier. And I think one of the main reasons for the delay is that quite a lot of the packaging waste that's in scope of DRS is also the same waste that's littered or found in public bins. So I think they just want to make sure that we don't get a situation where you're paying EPR for a very short period of time before DRS comes in, or that you have difficulties in kind of unpicking that, or issues with potential double counting. So I won't labour on these slides, but we've got a couple of slides here that set out the full scope of materials that will be required to be collected by household and non-household properties by March 26, obviously with the exception of film. And then just to summarise some of the headlines that are coming out of simpler recycling that Stuart's touched on. So consistent collections of food and dry recycling. Obviously dry recycling is materials only, there's no specific requirements on containment or frequency. If local authorities are providing a commingled collection that includes paper and card within that mix, then they will need to undertake an assessment and provide a written assessment similar to a TEEP test. And the government has provided a basic template for local authorities to populate, and then you retain a copy of your assessment, which should be reviewed at kind of key trigger points similar to a TEEP assessment in the past. There's no longer the minimum frequency for residual waste, and no new burdens funding for implementing the collection of the additional materials, with the exception of food waste, which authorities have already received that payment. And then also there's no capital lump sum funding expected under the EPR scheme. It will just be the agreed payments that you would receive each quarter, apart from in the first year where there's 3 payments. And the payments aren't ring fenced, so in theory authorities could decide how those are spent. And the payments will reflect reasonable costs that are incurred for the packaging proportion of the waste that you collect.
Victoria, can I ask, to your knowledge, I know there are a number of authorities who are actually challenging their settlement. I just wondered if, to your knowledge, do you know if any of those have been successful?
Not that I'm aware of,
no.
Because when they were published, they came along with a statement from government which said that they were fixed and not, authorities weren't able to challenge them. But the general consensus from authorities that did receive, I suppose nearly every authority who's implementing new food waste arrangements had a new burdens funding of some sort. The general consensus was that it was an underestimate of their costs for various different reasons. It might be due to the data was modelled or the factors that were included in the modelling. But I think the line that we are aware of from DEFRA is that that is the amount they'll be they have received, and that will be it. So I haven't heard of any successful challenges on that front.
Okay, thank you.
Just to touch on the TEEP assessment part slightly. So when can you collect paper and card together? Well, essentially you should do it unless one or more of these following statements can apply. So it's not technically practicable, with language we'll be familiar with from before, not economically practical, or has no significant environmental benefit. As we know from TEEP, evidencing for a whole authority that it's not technically practicable is challenging, because there are likely to be types of properties and circumstances that are evidence elsewhere which demonstrate that it is technically practicable. However, the examples that have been given in the template assessment form that you can fill in are things like depot capacity and space, but it does suggest that those sorts of arguments, if you like, within your assessment are likely to be considered temporary, and that in the future you should be seeking to make arrangements to enable that to happen. In terms of not being economically practicable, in our experience, we've found that the margins between a fully commingled service and a two-stream service can be quite narrow, and costs can come out quite similar when you take into account the full costs. And there hasn't been any guidance as yet as to the extent to which something is economically practicable or not. So at what point it becomes, it'd be considered affordable. What does that gap need to be for it to be considered that it meets the requirements? And then even more difficult is probably the environmental benefit, because at the moment, we don't know what significant means in this context, but also there's only one existing carbon tool that's sort of in common use, which has actually only been released, I think, last week, is RAPS Carbon Warm, the second version, where it actually has distinct carbon metrics for for source separated and for commingled materials. But what isn't quite clear from those metrics is what RAP actually mean by source separated, because we all know that materials such as cans and plastics in a source separated collection system are collected together. So we don't know what degree of separation they're considering when they're looking at paper and card. Is that a single material or is it two materials? And also there's probably some more work to be done there about looking at the whole service impact in terms of carbon, and there aren't many tools that allow you to do that effectively. So
could I just ask a question out to people on the webinar here? Has anyone actually started to do any work on that, or think about that kind of local version of TEEP to sort of evaluate some of these options? If you have, maybe you could just put your thumb up or something.
Well, I'll just carry on and then we'll see if any comments come in. But yeah, so you have to provide this written assessment, or essentially produce it and keep hold of it should you be asked to provide it. The other question is, could this TEEP test, I'm calling it TEEP because I'm not really sure what the collective term is for the new assessment, but I think hopefully everyone knows what I'm talking about, could it actually result in you doing something or having to do something that you don't really want to do? So in a successful commingled system, they're generally quite popular with residents and members. If you do your assessment and you find that actually a two-stream service is what meets the requirements under simpler recycling, could that then mean that you have to move to a system that really isn't your preference, and do all the necessary communications and relearning and buying containers and all of that kind of logistical thing that go along with that? As I've touched on there about what does significant environmental benefit mean? What are we talking about in terms of recycling performance? Because that will be a consideration as well. What are the margins? What are the the bounds of significant, really? And hopefully the statutory guidance would give some more clarity on that. And then there's also a question of whether you could be compliant with simpler recycling. So you're collecting all the materials, you've done an assessment, and you've deemed that you're happy with whatever collection system you're going with, whether it's two-stream or curbside sort, commingled, whatever. But then it comes to your EPR assessment, and then your service is deemed either inefficient or ineffective, and that could prove to be quite challenging because you're compliant on one hand and not on another, and that could impact your funding going forward. And also another sort of slight question in your TEEP test is whether, obviously the figures aren't fully known yet, but could your EPR funding be taken into account in the economic justification for your chosen system for simpler recycling? But given that's largely tonnage driven, that probably balances out against your recycling rate performance factor, so they probably cancel each other out. And then if we sort of move on to looking at packaging EPR, as we know, local authorities are in the legislation due to receive payments for the full necessary net costs of recovery for an efficient and effective service. for the financial year 25-26, this is they've classed this as a basic payment, and it's based on modelled costs. And so the modelling that's been undertaken to arrive at the costs that each authority the payment that each authority will receive and be notified of later this year are things like rurality and deprivation, local circumstances, the amount of waste that's collected and managed, and an estimated composition of that waste, because obviously we need to know what proportion of the waste is packaging. And the scheme administrator has been confirmed to be PAC UK. And in the first year, the base fees will be paid. And then in the second year, packaging producers will then need to pay the modulated fees. So in the first year, they'll pay base fees. And then in the second year, those fees will be modulated. And essentially what that means is the more recyclable the material so your packaging's made of, the lower the fee you'll pay to place that material on the market. So yeah, the more recyclable the material, the less as a producer you will pay under EPR. The current estimations from the packaging industry are that the total cost of the system might amount to 2 billion for the current financial year. And the government has confirmed that payments totaling 1.1 billion will be paid to local authorities in 25-26.
I was reading something, Victoria, about Marks and Spencer's. I think their bill for EPR here is 40 million, an annual bill of 40 million, which is obviously going to have some sort of impact on the way that they are producing their waste, and is a significant impact, isn't it? If you look at that across the whole of the packaging industry, that 2 billion.
Yeah.
Is an immense amount of money, isn't it, that people weren't paying previously? So it's going to have a significant impact, isn't it, on something somewhere, so
yeah, it'd be interesting to see what that amounts to as a percentage of turnover or a percentage of profit in that industry. And I haven't had time to think about that and do the maths, but I suppose the counterpoint to that is that these are costs that, if you look at it in a full life cycle kind of approach, they're costs that they ought to have been paying at the outset. And I suppose that's the intention. But clearly, the people who will be impacted by it are consumers, because that's where the cost is going to go. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting looking at the EPR from the packaging industry perspective. I'm on the Centre Council for the Northeast of CIWM, and we were arranging the Christmas event. We had Luke Fitzsimmons, who's the sustainability manager for Nestle, speaking, and it was absolutely fascinating. Looking at EPR, if you like, from the other side of the camera, because we're very familiar with it from a kind of local authority point of view and the impact and the funding, etc. But to see that they are taking it incredibly seriously. They've already started to implement some of those some measures. So the the Quality Street wrappers and stuff are actually now they've changed the consistency of those.
the Pringles tube that we
Yeah,
always hold up.
yeah, exactly.
Like the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Has already started to move to cardboard.
And it was really interesting to see the whole thing from that perspective, to realise that actually Marks and Spencers are not going to pay 40 million pounds every year without doing anything, without changing anything. So kind of that's where, for me, that's the interesting part of this from the other side of the equation, is to see how the industry will respond. And I just wanted to throw a point in here, which is about the fact that EPR for me is not just about changing the funding from one side of the equation, local authorities and the public funding it, to the producers funding waste. It's about radically transforming the problem. The idea is you as I said, polluter pays, the polluter does pay, but they're actually going to find other ways and other technologies and ways of actually making sure that they can minimize waste, aren't they? It's the reason I'm mentioning that is because I'm thinking for for many of us, we're just seeing this is an ongoing recycling funding stream, but actually the whole point of this is it's a tapering funding stream. So and my call out to those who are from local authority here is to brace yourselves, because the world's not going to stay the same forever. I think we're going to start to see the impact of that after the second year of fees to the waste producers, packaging producers. Anyway, that's just my kind of thought at this point. I know you're going to go back to local authorities, but I thought it was worth just throwing that in. And
I mean, they'll be certainly looking at the base, the latest release of base fees as producers, and be doing cost benefit analyses on whether, moving to more sustainable packaging, investing in product design and innovation, and also schemes such as the refill as an alternative to single-use packaging, as a way of, reducing that financial burden on them as a business, because this isn't the only area where packaging producers will be hit, because we've also got the plastic tax. So if you're not meeting the targets in terms of recycled content, you've got the plastic tax and you've got packaging EPR as well on the same product lines. So interesting. One thing I didn't mention was earlier today we were trying to work out roughly what the 1.1 billion looked like in terms of per household. And based on our rough calculations, we think it's around, I don't know, something like £350 per household. So it's on average, obviously, because it won't be spread evenly, but it's not an insubstantial amount of money across the sector. So then, looking at some of the other areas that are kind of linked to this, is that we have the statutory targets. So we've got the 65% recycling target for municipal waste set out in the Environment Act with the date of 2035. And so then again, I did some rough calculations here. So we've got a current household recycling rate of, or current based on the latest data, of 44%. So if you then assume every authority offered collections of the additional streams under simpler recycling, and they performed in terms of what they collected equivalent to the average that we're currently getting for those other materials from the authorities who already collect them, I think that gets us to about 53% recycling rate. So that suggests that we've got quite a bit to do still, and probably quite a lot to do on commercial waste to make up that gap. And there isn't very accurate data. We've got a rough estimate of how much commercial waste that is generated, but in terms of how much of that is recycled, and also what proportion of that would fall under the classification of municipal waste, is where you start, the numbers start to get a bit more difficult. So it sort of suggests that simpler recycling on its own, without other interventions such as through eco collections and so on, it still might not be enough to get us to 65%. So there may be more to follow. This might not be the end of policy development in the waste sector in the next 10 years. So if
just to add my thoughts on that, is the evidence from Wales, certainly where they're meeting that 65%, met it a few years ago, is that they've worked incredibly hard on environmental education and environmental enforcement to get there, to make sure that the samples are as clean as possible. I think that was kind of inevitable, and I think we'd probably talked about this in previous years, that just by agreeing the list of materials doesn't guarantee that you're going to get there to meet the standards. There's a lot more involved, isn't there? Communication.
And I actually, just a few bits there on sort of the importance of the business waste. Of the total waste production or estimate in 2020, only 14% of that was household waste. Okay, appreciate a lot of that will be industrial and demolition waste, but there's still quite a lot that's within the C&I that's probably municipal, that we can target. And I guess that's part of what simpler recycling is trying to achieve. But one of the big challenges with that and businesses is that it's not very clear, if at all, in existence, an enforcement route for ensuring that either individual businesses take up collection services that are compliant with simpler recycling, or that operators offer that service to every one of their customers. So at the moment, that's an area where it will need to improve, but it's whether it's fully got mechanisms that enable that to happen, because at the moment it feels a little bit like it's self-enforcing.
Yes.
And I'm just looking at the comments here. So the comment around MAFs being able to separate commingled materials very well. I think the main concern, although I do accept your point and I have worked at a MEF, is still the concern with glass contamination and other materials and its impact on paper and card, and the fact that we've probably got quite a range of MEF qualities, if you like, in terms of their technological capability. So perhaps that's something that the government will come back to later down the line, or because it isn't mandated that you separately collect it, provided you can meet that test. If you have got a commingled service that can achieve the same environmental outcome, or not significantly, it's not going to deliver a significantly better environmental outcome for you to separately collect it, you can collect it commingled. So if you are using a state-of-the-art MEF that is achieving that quality standard, there isn't a significant economic detriment. It's technically practicable. You know, you only have to meet one of those three criteria. You don't have to meet all of them. So it might be, yes, it's technically practical to separately collect the paper. However, it's not significantly better environmentally for us to separately collect than you could. Yes, is the quality standard written down yet? No, not yet. Nor is the environmental benefit. So I think that's the difficulty, is the current justifications are based on your own
Interpretation.
interpretation. Yeah,
Yeah.
very much so. And your own understanding of what would be considered best practice or significant. So it might be that statutory guidance provides some clearer information on what these boundaries are between, you know, what's significant, what's necessary, what's, you know, what's efficient, what's effective, to enable authorities to make informed decisions about this. So it's still very much a go with the best of what you know at the moment.
Carol Lovers just said, surely wouldn't it be better to collect glass separately and mix paper card with plastic? Which, yeah, there is some merit in that. They have that type of service and are achieving 57%.
Yeah, I think one of the comments was that of materials that go through a commingled process, the material that receives the most, or the material that's most negatively impacted by that process is paper and card. And there's other reasons for that, not just glass. You know, the paper industry will tell you that things like moisture can be an issue, and it's much more likely that there's higher moisture content when you've got bottles and cans, which may have residues in them, than if you have separate collected paper, obviously provided that it hasn't rained a lot and it's not in an open pot box. But yeah, there is some assessments that have been done as part of the initial work when this was a work for consultation that kind of underpin the thought process from the government in how we've arrived at I suppose the options that are on the table now.
Yeah, Paul's just mentioned there that flexibles will be an issue with paper and plastics together. That's a good point.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think we've really got a very clear direction on how best to collect flexible plastics at the moment, because most of the trials, so the Flex Collect trials, have taken a either a separate or a survival bag type approach, in order that those materials are extracted right at the beginning of the process, of any processing. But yeah, having worked in a MRF, I can sympathise. They get wrapped around everything,
Yes,
and they
yeah.
can behave quite similarly to paper. And also, people put in junk mail and magazines and things that they haven't even opened, still wrapped in the plastic, thinking that they're doing the right thing because they're recycling the film and the paper wrapped together. So yes, I very much sympathise with your comments there.
Mark Mowen's question from Newcastle: Is there any research on how much recycling material is still in the residual stream due to households not using collection systems correctly? We do a waste composition analysis service. I mean, it's fascinating, but that's it's very interesting. And actually, I think the answer there is it varies depending on kind of socioeconomic group, and you've got some socioeconomic groups that really do abide by all of the requirements and are very good, and others are very poor. And yeah, but actually, Mark's question there on whether there's the sort of centralized piece of research, do you know if that's the case,
Victoria? There is some ongoing sampling. It's not every authority, but it's as part of the EPR work. So some sampling's being undertaken in order to determine what proportion of all of the waste, so that includes the residual stream, is packaging waste under the scope of EPR. So that will certainly give an indication of recyclable packaging waste that exists within the residual on a broader scale, because the sample will cover lots of different authority types within, with different, as Stuart mentioned, about different demographics and so on. There have been some estimates. I can't remember what the most recent one was, but I can certainly have a look to see what the latest is. I think it's a little bit out of date in terms of national view on what we think the composition is. But yeah, there's certainly material out there to go at that's still within the residual stream. And I would say from our experience, probably plastics is the most difficult. From you can be collecting all of the materials, and there's still can be quite a lot of flexible plastics and pots, tubs and trays, because they're typically the ones that contain raw meats, yogurts, things that you actually have to physically wash and clean, rather than a plastic bottle that you can give a quick rinse and then fling it in the bin. So yeah, that's certainly an area where there's still a lot of recyclables. And then obviously food, because participation in food, even when you have a food collection system, can be very variable. And I think as Stuart mentioned, the uptake, the range in participation can be very varied between authorities. Some areas the participation rate can be as low as 20%. So it's one of those streams that it's quite hard in certain areas to get people to participate in, and particularly when you're looking at communal properties, they're very difficult to engage with residents because you've got containers that aren't very pleasant. If you're on your way out, you're carrying down your little bags of food waste, or if you take your caddy from inside the house, then do you have to go back up to your 10th floor flat with your little caddy to put it back in your kitchen? So it's things like that. They're just little barriers, can add up, and they can determine whether someone participates in the scheme at all. So those are the kind of things that we're still working on and trying to come up with innovative ways to get people participating. So then looking at the packaging targets, so I've put a little snapshot here of what the packaging targets are for the next 3 years. And in 2023, 64.8% of packaging was recycled. What's a bit uncertain at the moment is what happens when DRS, so what happens to the targets in 2027 when DRS is introduced. Obviously the tonnage will come down that you're looking at, because once the DRS materials will be exempt from this, they'll be out of scope. But then if you're looking at materials like aluminium, drinks cans will no longer be part of EPR because they'll then be in DRS. But then that leaves you with the more difficult aluminiums to recycle, the aerosols and foil lined products, which are more difficult to recycle anyway, but also it's that communication piece again around getting people to engage and participate and understand that those materials can go in the collection system. So more measures might be needed in the future to to make sure that we meet those targets. And then there's also a question of what might happen to the value of PRNs later down the line if those targets are getting too challenging. So you might end up with your EPR cost and then also a high PRN cost. So it could be quite difficult once DRS gets implemented, and sort of how you unpick that to make sure that it's fair and representative of the costs and that the targets are balanced. So I've done a little summary here of some of the immediate, I suppose, challenges for local authorities as we see them. Stuart and I had a little chat about what we thought these were. So there's no statutory guidance yet published. So if you're trying to do a TEEP assessment, I mean, it touches on the comments that have been coming in the chat. How do you know what's significant? How do you know, what the bounds of performance need to be significant enough to enable you to make a decision one way or another? And yeah, that isn't clear. So hopefully guidance will come to assist authorities in that decision making. We've got the boundary reorganisation. I suspect some of you on this call may be authorities that are part of that, and that's going to come with its challenges because it doesn't only impact on things like collection and disposal contracts, but also on things like commissioning. So you might have a proposed unitary which is made up of authorities that have in-house, outsourced and LATCO services, and obviously it'll take a time to bring all of those different service arrangements together. Obviously they'll have different waste service designs potentially, and also how do you make decisions in the short term when you don't know which authority, because some areas are considering 2 or 3 options on the table at the moment around how those boundaries might be configured. So making decisions in the short term is quite challenging because you've also got things like infrastructure needs to consider, or you might have a treatment contract that's coming up for renewal, but actually you don't know what the future structure might look like for your authority and what you're actually procuring. So it's really quite challenging. We've also got ETS costs coming in, which is another burden alongside other additional costs. And at the moment, because it'll be a market-driven metric, it's quite difficult to do accurate projections of what the ETS implication might be for an individual authority. You can make estimates, but that might not, it'll be interesting to see how it actually plays out once it's implemented and what the real impact will be. As I mentioned previously, sort of separate food waste collection, so hard to reach properties, are very challenging. If you've got flats above shops, we've seen some local authorities where you've got a very urban, densely populated area with very high footfall on the street in a very high profile area where actually there isn't anywhere to put out caddies for collection, and there's no space on the street to have a bulk container for communal collections of food waste either. So, how do you service those properties? What would work that makes it, not have a detrimental impact on the street scene, not create unnecessary litter, but at the same time enable those types of properties to have access to a service that the government has stated they need to have a weekly collection for. So that's an interesting one that we're grappling with at the moment.
You were also mentioning there, Victoria, that some private landlords are refusing to receive the council's food recycling bins. So, where does that leave the individual residents who might want to participate, but
yeah, that one's really challenging because actually there's no legal mechanism that the authority can use against the landlord to enforce them to have the containers. So it's quite difficult because you'll have residents, contacting the council appealing to have containers, and then the managing agent being or landlord or whoever is sort of responsible for the property being unreceptive or unengaging in terms of allowing that to happen. And that's difficult, particularly in areas where having separate containers wouldn't make sense because you've got too many properties for that to be operationally effective, and nowhere for 100 people to present a caddy. It can be quite challenging. So that's another issue with those non-standard household properties. And then we've got a question for the future, but how does packaging EPR and DRS interact? How will they interact with each other? So one of I suppose the main one which we can see straight off as a challenge is plastic bottles, because they will fall into two distinct categories when DRS comes in, because you'll have your bleach bottle, which will be EPR, and then you'll have your drinks bottle, which will be DRS. However, there'll be some people who likely won't take the drinks containers, back to the shop for their deposits. They will put them in their recycling at the curbside. So then what's the local authority to do? They won't get EPR payments for the bottles that are DRS, but they'll still have to collect them. They can also receive the deposits from the plastic bottle proportion, but how do you separate those materials if you've got to go through them and work out how many bottles are DRS bottles and how many are not DRS, and how do you evidence that to get the deposits back, or how do you evidence that in your tonnage for EPR? So it's quite it'll be quite interesting to see how that plays out, because obviously at this stage it's quite difficult to efficient and effective. That's not quite the definitions that. So just looking at the chat, that Alan's put a comment in there. So essentially, effective will be meeting a performance standard in terms of recycling recovery relative to organisations or authorities that are similar to you in nature. And there may be additional metrics that come in time, but at the moment we're looking at recycling rate. Appreciate the tongue-in-cheek comment there. And then in terms of efficient, it will be, are you delivering it cost effectively, basically, relative to your peers, and that's authorities that are grouped with you. So if your service is coming out as poor performing or expensive, then you will be given a period of time to implement an improvement plan to make your services more cost effective or better performing. And then if you meet that within the improvement plan time, you carry on getting paid your full entitlement under EPR. If, however, you don't meet that, then you'll receive a reduction of up to 20% in the payments you receive. And actually, for some authorities, that might involve a cost benefit analysis to work out, well, if I'll receive, what's 20% as a worst case scenario? Will it cost me less than 20% of the lost in payment to implement those changes that are needed to get to that performance standard? So that's kind of what that will look like.
Interesting challenge.
Yeah, it could be. There's going to be some business cases, I think.
Yes.
To try and work out, how much you can invest to ensure you get the funding. So I've listed out some actions here that we think authorities need to be thinking about in the short term. The first one is to wait. So come June, you should know what the packaging EPR funding will be for the current year. And then I think, as we mentioned earlier, ramping up and preparing for simpler recycling, doing your TEEP assessment, working out how you can collect the materials effectively that you're not already collecting. Because that might, for most authorities, they'll be like, well, we are collecting those materials. But then for some, as you dig into the detail, you find that some of the difficult properties they aren't servicing. And that's the challenge, is that this legislation applies to all properties, including, hard to reach communals, etc. So I think that for some authorities, that might be the more challenging piece, is not, your standard properties, it's your difficult properties. If you're offering a commercial waste service, is to make sure that that is compliant with the requirements under simpler recycling. It should already be, but if it's not, You know, are you offering food waste to all of your customers? Can they collect all of the materials with the exception of film? And just making sure that your services are compliant. And then if you're a local authority with a recycling rate that's low relative to similar authorities, then you need to think, you know, you need to start thinking about how you could increase that performance, how you could get it closer to what other authorities that are similar to you are achieving, because the risk of not doing that is that you could receive a lower packaging EPR funding after the first year. So if your service is deemed not to be effective. There is also a question there about efficiency, but I think it's a bit more difficult for local authorities, you know, by themselves to understand whether their services are cheap or expensive relative to their neighbours. And I think that's probably a bit of a difficult one to ask. So that's it from me.
Victoria, thank you. That's there is so much material in there. The kind of good news, I suppose, for everyone attending is that we'll be sending out copies of the video, and we'll send out also copies of the chat as well. But Victoria, I just want to say thank you very much for sort of taking the time and doing the work on behalf of all of us. You know, delving into the documents to sort of pull together that what is a really good data source. I just wanted to have one final thought, which was of those sort of requirements and skills that we talked about here. I've just been writing down sort of public-private partnership working, communication skills, communicating with the public to convince them to continue to put out the correct materials, negotiation skills, and creativity. And I'm thinking of which of those did we maybe guess would be part of the role of waste management. But then again, just to go back to work that CIWM has done, you know, they did an awful lot of work on the future skills matrix, which is kind of preparing waste managers for circular economy, and just to sort of tick off those skills. They're all in there. You know, those are all the kind of things that we need to be thinking about as we move forward. So you know, if you haven't got any of those skills, or if you're lacking in some of those skills, then there's some training resources out there. But yeah, really interesting presentation. Thanks very much, Victoria. Really, I enjoyed it. I hope everyone did. Thanks very much for joining us. Have a very good and relaxing Easter weekend. Victoria, thanks again.
Yeah,
and we'll see you all again. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.